Troublesome newcomers. Plants and animals have accompanied humans for centuries. The development of civilization and migrations have resulted in alien species becoming established in areas where they did not previously occur. The flora of Poland comprises about 3,500 species, and almost one-third of them are alien species. When talking about the invasion of biological alien species, we must not forget that the presence of some alien species in new areas is very beneficial. World agriculture, including in Poland, is based on several species of cultivated plants, several species of reared animals, which have been imported from other parts of the world. Plants such as maize or potatoes are not species indigenous to Poland, nor are chickens or carp species indigenous to Poland. They have been introduced by humans. Out of 100 species introduced into the environment, 10 will take root and 1 will become an expansive invasive alien species. While it may seem that this 1% of species, 1 in 100 that survives, is a small fraction, we must consider that the absolute number of new species that are brought into a new place is very large. The pond slider is a species that was brought en masse by people as an ornamental animal. These turtles reach large sizes very quickly, and perhaps not so much that they have outgrown the aquaria of owners who are unprepared in terms of content and keeping such animals at all, but precisely the expectations of these owners. Abandoned pond sliders in the environment pose a threat first and foremost to amphibians that are already eating at the level of the scutum and tadpoles, but also to adult amphibians. Then there is the transmission of pathogens of diseases such as salmonella, chlamydia, of which they are the vector. These diseases are dangerous not only to animals, but also to some extent to humans who use various types of water bodies. The chances of becoming infected is only increased because these turtles are most often abandoned in urban areas. It is very often thought that the problem of alien turtles, the alien species turtles themselves, pose a threat mainly to the only native turtle, the European pond turtle. However, this is not quite the case in fact. In most cases, these turtles do not even have the opportunity to meet each other. In the case of mere interaction between a pond slider and a European pond turtle, it is simply the case that the already alien species will even displace the turtle in such a way that it occupies a convenient position for lounging in the sun. In the case of the pond slider, we are talking about animals that used to be pets that have been abandoned by humans, and it is absolutely wrong to say that the places where they are in a state of abandonment are their freedom or their home. As owners, but also as humans, it is our responsibility to take them out of that environment. We shouldn't put the responsibility on the natural world for our mistakes either. And they too should be caught. The raccoon dog somewhat resembles a dog. It is native to Asia. The natural range of this species includes northeastern Siberia, Japan, Korea, and parts of the Indo-Chinese peninsula. In Poland, it is an established species occurring almost throughout the country since the 1960s. Data on raccoon dog invasion and genetic studies indicate that it has colonized Poland from the east. It is a natural expansion. Almost any environmental conditions suit the raccoon dog. It can affect ecosystems primarily through the transmission of diseases and parasites, and to a lesser extent through predation or competition with native species. The most significant diseases transmitted by raccoon dogs are rabies and scabies. By transmitting parasites and pathogens, raccoon dogs can also affect humans and the animals they keep. The wild black cherry was introduced in the post-war period into post-field habitats to enrich poor pine forests. However, due to its exceptional adaptability and production of extremely tasty fruit eaten en masse by birds, it spread to more areas. Very characteristic are the leaves of the black cherry, which are stiff and shiny and have a very distinctive reddish hairiness underneath on the nerves. The black cherry blooms very early. Several-year-old specimens can produce numerous inflorescences, characteristic hanging clusters of white flowers, and also very numerous fruits. Its expansion is causing a decrease in the area of native forest fruits, such as the popular blueberries or lingonberries. It is also causing changes in the landscape. Instead of open space in pine forests and sunlit pine trunks, we see wide patches of black cherry. Alien invasive species tend to follow a similar pattern. Taking advantage of their novelty, devoid of natural enemies and possessing excellent adaptive conditions, they quickly take control of a new area. They win the competition for food and other livelihoods with naturally occurring species. In addition, they transfer their pathogens to them, weaken and often push them out of ecosystems. The consequence is a significant reduction in biodiversity and a remodeling of the surrounding environment. The uncontrolled spread of alien species can therefore completely alter the space around us, depriving it of plant and animal species that have always been there. One of these species, or rather a group of species, is knotweed, which was brought to Europe from Asia back in the 18th century, primarily for ornamental purposes. Nowadays in Poland, but also in other parts of Europe, knotweed can be found in very different types of habitats, both those transformed by man, i.e. in cities, on roadsides, railway sidings, but also very often these plants penetrate semi-natural and natural communities. In particular, on a massive scale, we can say that they are spreading in river valleys, also encroaching on the habitats of fertile moist forests, including, above all, riparian forests. The habit of this plant and the stem structure itself is a little reminiscent of bamboo shoots, but a very distinctive feature of this plant is its biology. It is a herbaceous perennial plant that can reproduce both generatively, i.e. by forming very numerous seeds. On the other hand, it spreads with great ease through a system of rhizomes, which develop very extensively in the soil. These rhizomes can overgrow the soil to a depth of as much as 2 meters and spread an average of 7 to 20 meters from the parent plant. In front of our houses and in wooded areas just in front of the forester's lodge, you can see trees and shrubs that sometimes come from all over the world. Boxwoods from southern Europe, violet-scented lilacs from Asia Minor, bee-attracting robinias covered in white blossom, chestnut trees and western cedar trees from North America. Species cultivated by humans as ornamentals penetrate the forests from neighboring non-forest areas. Foresters experimented with foreign species, introduced them into experimental plots in the forests with the ultimate aim of achieving better timber. But there was also thought of changing the soil parameters, especially in poor coniferous forest habitats. Over the years, it turned out that the trees, adapting to our local conditions, began to exhibit behaviors that are dangerous to our native biodiversity and limit the occurrence of native tree species. Polish forests currently contain more than 200 species of woody plants of foreign origin. More than 30 alien tree species have been intentionally introduced, including 22 coniferous and 9 deciduous species. Of these, only some were introduced on a larger scale. We can include the green Douglas fir, the red oak, and the white pine known as the Weymouth pine. Most of the introduced trees are native to North America and Asia, with the remainder coming from Southern Europe. Our European bison, which is very important to us, we have more than 2,000 individuals living in the wild at the moment, has a cousin, that is, a species that belongs to the same genus, the American bison. These two species, of course, once originated in Asia and, through migration to one side of the world and the other, developed the European bison right here, and the American bison on the American continent, so they are related species. But these are two different species. What kind of threat is the American bison to the European bison? First of all, such that the American bison and the Wisent interbreed without any problems, producing hybrids, so-called in Polish żubronie. These are already animals that do not belong to either species and cannot serve to protect either of the two species. That is, from a wildlife point of view, these hybrids are unnecessary for us. Another threat is also the fact that an American bison coming to Poland, well, it brings with it everything that it has in its organism. So it can bring some bacteria, it can bring some parasites, which would come together with the American bison, to which the American bison could be immune, but the European bison is not. All over the world there are 500,000 American bison, so if we compare our 10,000 and 500,000 bisons, we are losing by a long shot, but in large part the American bisons are kept for breeding and meat production. And these bison meat farms are actually everywhere, and there are a lot of them in Europe. We don't want to have American bison in Poland because we know what a threat it is. We have regulations which prevent us from importing and keeping and breeding American bison, but how do we warn, as it were, other European countries of this threat? Well, it is not easy to explain to people that the threat in the form of, say, a farmed animal is to a free living species. I spoke to bison breeders many times, asking them the very mundane question of whether they had animal escapes in their breeding careers. And, of course, everyone replied that yes, the reasons could be various. Human negligence or destruction of a fence by a falling tree, for example. There can be many causes. Escape is probable. Of course, even if this probability is small, but not zero, that is, the escape of such an individual from the enclosure is a threat because he starts to be free in nature. The Himalayan balsam is native to the Western Himalayas and was brought to Poland as an ornamental and melliferous plant at the end of the 19th century. It then made its way from domestic gardens into the natural environment. It has a suitable habitat in river valleys where it is part of communities made up of both herbaceous plants and trees and shrubs. Himalayan balsam is characterized by its enormous seed production, up to 32,000 seeds per square meter. The design of the seed sacs allows the seeds to shoot up to a distance of 5 to 6 meters. Water carries them to even greater distances, while in the soil they retain their ability to germinate for at least 18 months. The impact of this plant on our nature is very negative. By growing in such dense patches, it prevents native plant species from germinating, growing up. The impact of this plant is also dangerous on pollinating insects. This species is the most nectariferous plant species in Europe. No other native plant in Europe produces as much nectar as Himalayan balsam. The consequence of this is that pollinators, especially bumblebees, feed very intensively on Himalayan balsams. The consequence of this is that they might neglect other plants and do not pollinate our native plants. Furthermore, as we have recently shown in our research, Himalayan balsams also draw pollinators away from commercial crops such as strawberries. Bumblebees are so attached to Himalayan balsams and feed on them so extensively that they wipe their body hairs as they enter and leave the flowers, which can cause problems with keeping their bodies warm. This has not yet been fully investigated, but if it were confirmed, it would be another indication of the very negative impact of Himalayan balsam on native wildlife. Invasive alien species are also insects. In autumn, congregations of Asian lady beetles, which are found throughout Poland, introduced to greenhouse facilities in Western Europe, have spread to other environments. The Asian lady beetle is a threat to native ladybird species due to competition and predation on their larvae. A troublesome aspect of the species' biology is the formation of very large aggregations, often in residential buildings. The western conifer seed bug is a species of true bug. It is native to North America, west of the Rocky Mountains. It has recently expanded its range and has been accidentally introduced into parts of Europe. In its natural range, the western conifer seed bug feeds on the sap of developing conifer cones, causing the developing seeds to wilt and become diseased. It is considered a minor pest of trees, but can be more damaging. For example, in forests where trees of a single coniferous species predominate. Another garden escapee growing naturally in North America has also established itself and spread into moist habitats. Wild cucumber fruits with distinctive pouches that conceal 4 seeds. Water makes it much easier for the wild cucumber to colonize new areas, especially river valleys. Czesław Niemen, in a song to a text by Julian Tuwim, sang that autumn begins with mimosas, perhaps referring to the Canadian goldenrod or the giant goldenrod. And indeed, once upon a time, these yellow flowering goldenrods were a sign of the approaching autumn. Perhaps as a result of the fact that our climate is changing a little, the lyrics of this song are a little outdated now because the goldenrods already start to flower practically at the beginning of August. This is a good example of how climate change can intensify the problem of biological invasions. There will be an increase in the frequency and variety of different types of new alien species being brought in with imported goods. Imports of these goods will be increased as a result of the fact that we may simply start to run out of certain goods, such as food. The common raccoon was brought to Europe from North America as a fur-bearing animal. In addition, it was introduced in Germany and Russia. It acclimatized in Germany, and from there the colonization of Europe began. Spontaneous expansion took place primarily using river valleys and lake districts. Its high reproduction and low mortality rates enable it to establish populations in newly colonized areas. In Poland, the raccoon is mainly found in the western part of the country, in a variety of habitats in the vicinity of water. It feeds on invertebrates and plant food, but can cause declines in rodents, birds, and even the pond turtle as a result of predation. Carried by raccoons, nematodes can also be a threat to humans, causing parasitic diseases. Giant hogweed is usually said to grow up to 2 to 3 meters tall, but sometimes they reach much higher heights, as seen here. This individual is about 4 meters tall. These huge stems are hollow in the middle. The umbels are usually several, even dozens, and vary in diameter. The largest is always on the axis of the main shoot. The stems are massive. At the base, they can be up to several centimeters in diameter. In fact, they look like small trees. Sosnowski's hogweed is an invasive alien species found in Poland. It is most easily recognized by its massive structure. When in flower, it reaches a height of 2 to 3 meters. When it is not flowering, it takes the form of a large leaf rosettes that are very large, around 1.5 meters square in area. By the size and massiveness, it is easiest to distinguish giant hogweed from other similar and often confused species. Giant hogweed was imported en masse in the 1980s to Poland to state agricultural farms and to the Agricultural Development Fund. They were supposed to be a food base for the cattle raised there. Unfortunately, the experiment failed, cultivation was abandoned, but not all the plants that were grown at the time were destroyed, and these began to spread and move to newer and newer areas. Under the term giant hogweed, there are 3 species of plants: Sosnowski's hogweed, Mantegazzi's hogweed, Heracleum mantegazzianum, commonly known as giant hogweed, and Persian hogweed, of which only 2 occur in Poland. Both of these plants are twinned and have the same invasive potential and toxicity. Therefore, from the point of view of the average person, it is not important to distinguish them from each other, but to distinguish them from all other native species that are similar and often confused with them. Their sap contains furanocoumarins, which cause a reduction in human and animal skin resistance to sunlight. Contact with such sap can result in so-called burns. Direct and indirect contact with giant hogweed should be avoided. Like any invasive alien species, Sosnovsky's hogweed has a number of adaptations that make it thrive in our native areas. This is aided by its huge leaf area, which limits the ability of other plant species to germinate, and the huge number of seeds it produces. The umbels of one individual can produce up to 100,000 seeds. As far as eradication is concerned, the search is still on for that one miracle method that would help us get rid of this species universally. Mechanical and chemical methods are the most commonly practiced. It seems that the most effective in terms of getting rid of a persistent species is the method based on digging up or reaming, damaging, cutting the root. Oriental bittersweet is a vine that occurs naturally in Japan, northeastern China, Mongolia, and the Korean peninsula. In the undergrowth, it often forms a dense cover, thus blocking the establishment of natural regeneration. With rapid biomass growth, it is guaranteed a clear dominance over other plant species, entwining with the tree crowns. It restricts the photosynthetic process and leads to their successive death. Sometimes Oriental bittersweet causes windbreaks and windrows and damage to branch trunks as well as branches. Vegetative reproduction by root suckers and through spontaneous rooting of shoots is of great importance in the expansion of Oriental bittersweet. The species can invade new areas very quickly and can be a high-risk invasive plant. American skunk cabbage was imported in the early 20th century from western Northern America for cultivation in Europe. The plant grows up to 1.5 meters. It produces a 30-centimeter vertical fleshy rhizome. The large leaves are bright green. The skunk cabbage threatens native species by being a very strong, shade-avoiding undergrowth in wet woodland and swamps and bogs. The gray squirrel and the black squirrel are two species of squirrel found naturally in the eastern United States and also in southern Canada. The two squirrels are quite similar to our native species of red squirrel, also with such reddish-gray fur, but definitely larger. The gray squirrel is a very problematic species, one of the 100 most invasive species in the world. They can potentially pose a significant threat to native wildlife, starting with the fact that they can compete. They can also be predators. They can eat bird broods. They can eat eggs from nests. They can also compete with hollow birds for nesting sites. The grey squirrel arrived in Europe a relatively long time ago. Its first introductions took place in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century in the UK and Ireland. And all these squirrels, as it turned out, gave rise to a very stable, very fast-growing, very invasive population, which within a few decades virtually exterminated the native species, the common squirrel, the red squirrel that we all know, from within the UK due to competition. The mechanism, the catalyst that has dramatically accelerated the displacement of the red squirrel by the grey squirrel up to 10 or 20 times faster according to some studies, is a virus. It is completely harmless to the grey squirrel, and it turns out that the grey squirrel is just a carrier of it. It has no symptoms, whereas for the red squirrel, this virus is absolutely fatal, and within 14 days or so, it just dies. The most important thing is to prevent the appearance of alien squirrel species in Poland. This invasion can probably be postponed, but it cannot be prevented completely. In the case of alien species, it is important to prevent here and now, not to allow the invasion, not to allow the species to spread, because by the time we see the negative effects of alien species, it is usually too late, and it is usually impossible to completely eliminate them from the environment. It is considered that we have 2 native crayfish for our waters. In addition to the noble crayfish, this would also include the Danube crayfish. In addition to the crayfish considered native, there are stable populations of as many as 4 invasive alien crayfish species in Poland, which together occupy the majority of Polish waters. The invasive spiny cheek crayfish is most frequently encountered in domestic waters. It is a species that has been introduced to one of the farms, from which it has of course later escaped. It is easy to identify. In fact, we know from its Polish name, the striped crayfish, that it is a striped crayfish, so we should expect some stripes. However, this is not a characteristic only of this species, and it is worth knowing this. A more important feature is a different type of stripe, namely the dark ring around the tips of the pincers of the spiny cheek crayfish, and more often than not it will be black, because when you see the orange tips of the pincers, right behind them you have a black ring on the underside. The pincers themselves are flesh-colored. There is no possibility of confusing it with, for example, the noble crayfish, whose pincers are always reddish-brown underneath. Even in the last century, another alien species was introduced which also proved to be invasive, namely the signal crayfish. It was also imported here for breeding purposes. In the last 20 years, 2 species of aquarium origin have also appeared in domestic waters. The Louisiana crayfish, whose numerous color variants can now be found in our waters, and the marbled crayfish. In this case, we are talking about 2 land-water crayfish that do not really even need the presence of any water to survive, overwinter, or simply reproduce. They are adapted to dig burrows not only in water, as crayfish normally do, but they can also dig burrows in forests, for example. As humans, we are responsible for nature. It is our actions, intentional and unintentional, that have brought alien species into our environment. Observed from afar, the forest ecosystem appears coherent and undisturbed. But invasive alien species affect the forest pollinators and native plants. They change the landscape from which naturally occurring species sometimes disappear irrevocably. Climate change and invasive alien species are the most important current threats to biodiversity. Let's remember that much in the natural world depends on us and our actions or inactions. We have a choice.